Morning, everyone. It's still morning, 5 minutes to. My name is Ivan Milanov. I'm one of the lecturers in the Department of Theological Studies at Newbold College. If you prefer my title, I'm Dr. Milanov Monday to Friday, but Pastor Milanov every day. Today's topic is the fall. We are going to concentrate our thoughts on Genesis 3, but we will also refer to the previous topic, that was Genesis 1 and 2, and also we'll go through some parts of Genesis 4 to 11. The topic is from order to chaos. Let me share a few facts with you from Genesis 3 and the topic of origins of sins. Or sin. The expression sin is not found in Genesis 3 at all. Also, the phrase fall in sin or the expression fall are not attested either in Genesis 3. Also, the expression origins of sin, macula, free will, all these phrases that are usually related to the fall in sin are not found here. So these are the facts. But at the same time, still theologians, scholars, they speak about fall in sin. So there must be much more in this narrative than just pure phrases. So our task would be today to interpret this text and find out whether there is fall in sin at all there, and also to find out if there is a fall in sin, what are the consequences? What is the issue? What is the problem? So basically today's attempt is something that Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologian, would say is part of every religious or theological system. He says that every religious system tries to convince you that something's wrong with this world. And when they explain what's wrong, the second thing is to tell you how this wrong will be solved. So every religious system does that. For example, from the Far East religions, they try to tell us that actually sin is illusion, maya. Actually, we are not aware of something else, and that's it's for them sin. For some other religions is different concept. But for Christianity and Judeo-Christian religions in general, especially for Judaism and Christianity, Genesis 3 is of crucial importance. So today we are going to look at Genesis 3 in a broader literary context of Genesis 1 to 11. And technically this part of the Bible is known among the scholars as primeval history. On the other side, we are going to look at the narrower literary context of Genesis 3, and that's Genesis 1 to 3. Also, we have to bear in mind that Genesis 3 is an ancient text primarily written for people in ancient Near East. That's why this text, this narrative, explains the things differently than probably we would expect. Because we come from a bit different culture, we come from different time, and we have to adapt a bit to this way of telling the story. Okay. This is the basic structure of Genesis 3. Firstly, in verse 1, there is an introduction of the serpent. There is no a lot explanation who the serpent is in Genesis 3, but quite peculiarly, the serpent is introduced with a definite article. We know that at the beginning of the story, a noun with definite article, especially subject in the story, and character in the story, means that for the original readers, probably the serpent, the identity of the serpent was known, but not to the contemporary reader unless the contemporary reader reads the rest of the Bible and the picture is more complete. However, what is quite interesting in this introduction of the serpent is the adjective used to describe the identity of the serpent. Actually, the adjective could be translated in English as shrewd or crafty. Actually, that adjective is used in a quite ambiguous way in the Bible. For example, if you read the book of Job, this crafty, shrewd, is not used in a very positive, in a very, actually is used in a very negative way. On the other side, if you read the book Proverbs, you'll find out that this adjective is used there in a very positive sense, describing wise people, righteous people, choosing and doing the right thing. So the serpent is quite ambiguous, ambiguously described at the beginning of the story. Probably the reflection of that will be that later in the story, the activity, the seduction of these serpents will produce some kind of ambiguous results. Verses 2 to 6 actually describe the conversation, the dialogue between the serpent as the initiator of the dialogue and the woman as the one who responds to the questions of the serpent. From verses 7 to 20, God dominates the narrative as the main protagonist. So he asks questions, humans respond to these questions, he investigates in these verses, and also finally he produces in verses 21 and 22 his verdict on human beings. Okay, so far these facts, this kind of narrative inspired some contemporary biblical scholars who think that actually in Genesis 3 we can't talk about fallen sin. There is an American scholar, her name is Lynn Bechtel. She promoted 15 to 20 years ago an idea that actually Genesis 3 is not a historical description, that's a mythology. And this myth is not about humankind falling in sin, but actually this is a myth of maturation. So Adam and Eve are like toddlers. God created them, and they started growing up, emotionally, mentally. And she uses some points of developmental psychology, and she applies to this text, and she says, well, in the story, in the story is described their growing up. And there is no sign of them falling in sin. One of the problems of this approach is that she applies, or better said, she imposes on a biblical text that is quite long away in terms of culture, in terms of way of thinking, in terms of time, from the developmental psychology known today. And secondly, very importantly, she doesn't pay much attention to the dynamic of the story and how the things developed. So my task now will be to try to show you and present you how the whole story within the context of Genesis 1 to 11 shows that we can talk about fall in sin. What are the key ideas in Genesis 3? Firstly, in verse 5, we find this counter statement told by the serpent. And this counter statement is actually second statement of the serpent. Serpent is the initiator of this conversation, dialogue with the woman that started with slight exaggeration and change of God's words from Genesis 2. Because the snake or the serpent asked the question, did God really forbid you from eating from every or all trees? And this is exaggeration. According to the character of the serpent, that the serpent is a biggest character, we can see that this question, which could be understood as a close question that you can say yes or no, is full of ambiguity. Something is true, something is not true. And this question, even asked as a closed question, asking for or requiring yes or no answer, the woman correctly recognizes that this question needs a more elaborate answer. However, she responds to this question also with exaggeration, telling the serpent that they can eat freely from every single tree in the garden except the tree of knowing good and evil, that they can't eat from and they should not touch it. The last statement about touching the tree is not God's statement or commandment from Genesis 2. So there is another exaggeration. And to that, the serpent responds with the idea, with a counter answer saying, you are not going to die, but you will become like God, knowing what is good and what is bad, or what is evil. Now, this is the basis, this is the foundation of the temptation given in front or before the woman. You will become like God. Some English translations, they do not translate God with capital G and in singular, but they translate it and write it as with small g and in plural. In the original language, it is used so-called functional plural, Elohim, but the writer in Genesis 1-3 quite consistently applies this name Elohim to God with capital G and in singular. How do we know that? Because usually, first, Elohim is accompanied with verb in third masculine singular, and secondly, there are no other gods in Genesis 1-3. Basically, several scholars in the past quite convincingly argued that Genesis 1-11 is a highly polemical text. And the polemics is with the mythology of the surrounding nations. And this text actually, or these narratives, argue that the description of creation is completely different than the creation mythology of the surrounding nations. For example, in Mesopotamia, one of the main gods was Marduk. And in one of their cosmogonical myths, or mythology about how the world, the universe, was created, they described that actually Marduk was in a conflict, in a battle, in a fight with the goddess Tiamat, the primordial ocean. Eventually Marduk, he killed Tiamat, and from one part of her body, he created the heavens, and from the other part, he created the earth. However, when you read Genesis 1, God has no opposition. There is no struggle in Genesis 1. Actually, in Genesis 2, God has no opposition. There is no struggle. There is no competition from other gods or deities at all. So in Genesis 1:3, there are no other gods except God. So that's why we translate this, you will become like God. So the main temptation put before the humans is to be like God. The essence of every single sin me and you do in our lives is actually related to this. That we that when we sin or commit sin, actually we say, I decide what is good or what is bad. I don't care what God thinks, but I'm God to myself. I'm autonomous. I decide what is to be done regardless of God. So that's the attitude we have. Now, that's the temptation. Verse 6 is very peculiar in describing the so-called inner life of the woman. That's one of the techniques of characterization used by the writer. Actually, he gives us an insight what went through her mind while contemplating about this fruit. We are told that she was amazed by the fruit, forbidden fruit, because it was good for food. She was amazed by the fruit because it was a good design. And finally, she was amazed because it could have made somebody, it could make somebody wise or enlightened. The usual word for being wise is not used here, but it's slightly different, that rabbis usually translate as to be enlightened, to be wise. The same word in different verb in different form is used in Daniel 11 and 12 to describe God's people. They're not there described by the name of the institution. They're described by their character. They're called masculine. Hifil, participle, masculine in plural. And the translation is the wise ones. And in 12:10 in Daniel, they are juxtaposed and oppose the wicked, opposite of the wicked. And the wicked is moral and spiritual category. And the wise ones are just opposite of that. And usually, being wise, we immediately relate to being intellectual, to know. But in the Bible, it's much more than that. Also means to be faithful, to be loyal, to be obedient. Now, Eve contemplates to become wise by disobeying God's direct command. That's the point here. Verse 7. When they ate, both of them, their eyes were opened, and the serpent was right. But the problem was that they didn't like what they saw, that they were naked. Immediately after that, in verses 8 to 11, we can find a change in their relationship with God. They started hiding from God. They started fearing God. They started having a feeling of shame and guilt. And they went away when he came. So when he came, he called them, "Where are you? What happened to you?" So it's very interesting that according to the dynamics of the story, humans, when they became aware that they were naked, they hid from God. But God took an initiative to look and try to find them. So when somebody uses the phrase, "Did you find Jesus?" that's a wrong question. Because the question is, did Jesus find you? It was not Jesus who was lost. It was us who were lost. And this is also another argument that God is actively involved in looking for sinners. Abraham Heschel, one of the renowned rabbinic theologians, a rabbi himself from the 20th century. He wrote a book about the philosophy of Judaism. Some rabbis, they believe that there is no theology, that Judaism is not theology, it's more philosophy. Because some rabbis would tell you that in the Hebrew Bible there is no theology. Everything is ethics. And that's why they talk about philosophy of Judaism. And the subtitle of the philosophy of Judaism is God in Search of Humans. We are not surprised, because in Genesis 3, that's what he does. Now, in verse 12, we can see that there is a change not only in the relationship on the vertical, from a vertical aspect, but there is a problem on horizontal level as well. The same man who sang in Genesis 2, finally, bones of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and he was delighted to see the woman. Now he sings different song. And the song is, "No, God, yes, I did eat from the fruit, but no, it wasn't my fault. It was the woman." Adding, "who you created." So the point is that the man now is accusing the woman, but because the woman was created by God, it's you, God, who is at fault. The woman says, "No, it wasn't me. I was actually deceived by the serpent." But she didn't say, she's more subtle as a character, and she didn't say who you created, but that's actually fact from Genesis 1 and 2. So we see that after this act of disobedience, there is a quality change of the relationship between humans and God and humans and humans. For us, that's everyday reality. And probably this is one of the main issues we have as human beings. One of the main issues in our church, why people leave our church, or why people don't want to come anymore to our church, because we have very complicated or low quality human-human relationship. Verse 15, God puts an enmity between the humans and the animal, in this case serpent. In verses 16 to 18, there are changing in fulfilling the purposes of the man and the woman. Both of them will labor. The man he will work the land, and she will labor when she will bring children. She will bear children. Verse 19, the human is going to die. Basically, they go back from where they were taken from. This is the most radical change of the quality of life of humans. This is another principle that we can take from this text, that actually being disobedient to God, not listening to His will, not fulfilling His plans, brings changes in our physical and emotional life. One of them, the most radical, is death. Verse 20 says, another change in the relationship, that the man exercises some kind of authority over the woman. That wasn't the ideal from Genesis 1 and 2. There was no boss between humans then. But now it seems that he exercises some authority because he's given her name. And verses 21 and 22, the humans will not and must not live forever in the state they were. That's very interesting. We can go very philosophical on this question, especially reading the books of Albert Camus, or Camus, as it is expressed usually in these lands. Albert Camus was thinking intensively, if life is without any sense, if life is absurd, then why people do not kill themselves in greater numbers? So he was looking for that sense that kept them alive. So living forever in this condition, in condition of changed relationship with God, turbulent relationship with God, very complex and problematic relationship between each other, was definitely not for someone to live forever. Characterization of the characters. This is very interesting. The serpent is not described in its, or his, because in Hebrew, serpent is masculine noun. So he is not described by his physical appearance. He's not described by anything else except by the characterization of the character of the narrator, calling him shrewd or crafty. Also, it is described, or he is described, as a very intelligent animal and talking animal. The woman is very subtle and very active in the first part of the narrative. She tries to match the serpent. The serpent exaggerates, she exaggerates with the answer. The serpent tries to be ambiguous, she tries to be ambiguous. And the man in the first part of the narrative is very passive. He doesn't talk, he doesn't speak, he doesn't respond to anything. He's just described as someone who is lenient, who is complacent, and he just eats from the fruit. However, the man becomes very active later. So his wisdom came afterwards. Previously, he was passive, he was voiceless, but when he came to complain, he became very loud and very active. But he also, like the woman, tries to find excuses. And finally, God, he dominates in the narrative. Of course, he's not described by his physical experience. You're not going to find that much in the Bible, except probably in the Old Testament, except probably in Daniel 7, 9, and 10. But he's described in his attitude towards humans. Firstly, he takes the initiative to find them. Secondly, he takes time to ask questions. He produces some curses, but he never curses humans. He curses the ground and the serpent. And also God produces verdict. His behavior, to a certain extent, is quite ethically predictable. He's not arbitrary in his behavior. He's not volatile. He tries to learn or to find out the circumstances, and then he produces the verdict. Regardless of the fact that the Bible regards him omnipotent and omnipresent and that he knows everything, he publicly conducts an investigation and then delivers the verdict. Genesis 3 in relation to Genesis 1 and 2. The movement of events in Genesis 1 is from chaos, Genesis 1 and 2, to order. The culmination is the seventh day, Sabbath. The culmination of creation is blessing. It started with chaos, it ended in order and blessing. And God blessed the animals, God blessed the humans, and God blessed the time, the seventh day. On the other side, in Genesis 3, we are finding a completely different dynamics. everything moves from order to chaos. The humans and the animals who were blessed in Genesis 1, the animal becomes cursed in Genesis 3. And the ground is cursed, and the man who was about to keep and work that ground now is having problems. So we can see that the movement that is in Genesis 1 is completely reversed in Genesis 3. So that's fine. That's why we can define sin as a phenomenon that is totally opposite of creation. Somebody call it de-creation. What ended up in blessings, Genesis 1 and 2, ended up in curses in Genesis 3. Genesis 1 and 2, God is always in the primeval history, Genesis 1 to 11. Whenever God is initiator of any acts, like in Genesis 1 and 2, that results always in life and prosperity. Abundant life. God is initiator in Genesis 1. The end is blessing and life in prosperity. God is initiator in Genesis 2, and everything is alive and prosper. But in Genesis 3, the initiator is a created being. And the result is regression and death. Another reverse process. Genesis 1 and 2, there is a creational order where God is on the top of the hierarchy. Then humans, who are not completely like animals and who are not completely like God. They're quite original. And then animals. In Genesis 3, it seems that the animal comes on the top of humans. Because in the first part of the narrative, the animal drives the story. The conversation and everything else is according to his rules. So, animal, then humans, and God is shunned by humans on the bottom of this hierarchy. Completely opposite than Genesis 1 and 2. In Genesis 1, we have absence of conflict. It's the same in Genesis 2. No conflict. But in Genesis 3, there is a conflict on a vertical level and there is a conflict on a horizontal level. So the quality of life in the Garden of Eden is completely changed. Genesis 2 speaks of holy place. Taken together, Genesis 2 and 3 as a single narrative can give you at least 6 parallels between the Garden of Eden and the sanctuary as a concept. One of the first things that we learn about sanctuary, and when the sanctuary for the first time is mentioned in the Bible, is Exodus 25, 8 and 9. And the first role or function of the sanctuary was not to serve as a solution for human sins, but actually was to serve as a meeting point between God and humans. Garden of Eden is the meeting point between God and humans. Genesis 3. In the sanctuary, the priests were asked to work and keep or take care of the sanctuary. The same verbs, 2 verbs, you're going to find in Genesis 2. That the man, his purpose was to work and keep and take care of the Garden of Eden. Also, there is gold mentioned in the Garden of Eden, or the river that goes into 4 different rivers around the Garden of Eden. Also, there is gold in the sanctuary. There is an idea of water around the Garden of Eden. in front of the sanctuary, there was a big pot, basin with water called mikveh. What is very interesting is that these parallels was firstly noted by a non-Adventist biblical scholar, which is very good, because sometimes we criticize each other that we as Adventists, we see sanctuary everywhere. But thanks God, this gentleman is not an Adventist, and he saw parallels between the Garden of Eden and sanctuary. That's why some scholars, they call Genesis 2 a holy place, but in Genesis 3, they're expelled from the holy place. And the narratives of Genesis 4 to 11 and onwards will take place in a common world, in a common place, which will be very cruel world, completely different quality of life in that world. And finally, in Genesis 1, the humans and animals are blessed. Also, the time is blessed. But in Genesis 3, the animal is cursed, the ground is cursed, and the time will become cursed. Why? Because people will not live forever. They will die. The time is kind of an enemy to them. On basis of this and the previous said, I believe that we can talk about the fall in sin in terms of radically changed, completely changed of Edenic situation, the Garden of Eden, to something completely catastrophic. Let me put more arguments in that and compare Genesis 3 with Genesis 4 and 11. We don't know, I can't explain to you the technology or every single step how human beings from Genesis 3 became the type of human beings found in Genesis 4 to 11 with all this catastrophic behavior. But this movement is quite visible in the Bible. In Genesis 3, some people asked me the other day, they told me, some students, wow, eating from this tree, was it a bit banal, quite naive, trespassing? Why is that punishment? The problem is not in the act that much, but it's in the attitude that the humans attempted to be like God. That's the problem. It's not the act itself, but the attitude to become like God, to close that gap between the Creator and the created being. So in Genesis 4, we have the first murder. In Genesis 6 to 8, we have a mass destruction of the population on the earth. Why? That was God's reaction, because every single thought of the human beings at all time was evil. And they corrupted the earth, so God decided to corrupt them and destroy them. It's the same verb. So the punishment fits the crime. In Genesis 3, people attempt to be autonomous, to be like God. And if you go to Genesis 11, 3 to 4, you'll find the same expression used in Genesis 1 when God created human beings. In Genesis 11, 3 and 4, the human beings who speak one language now, who are super unified like never in the human history, they say, let us make bricks. Let us create a tower which top will be in the heavens. That's attitude. Let us be like God, because we would like to make a name for ourselves. The Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is notorious that good name comes exclusively from God as a gift. But these people, they say, let us make something that will bring name to us. They attempt to be like God. Genesis 3, God directly speaks to the culprits. While that situation will change a bit, he speaks to Cain directly in Genesis 4, but later he will only talk with positive characters. God tries and mitigates every situation in which humans commit sin. And he tries to mitigate the circumstances. For example, they don't die immediately. For example, he clothed them. And that's mitigation. On the other side, God protects Cain. He puts a sign on his forehead, not anyone should revenge against Cain. He spared Noah and his family, and he didn't kill people when they built the tower. He actually confused their languages and scattered them all over the place. God always investigates the situation of problem before issuing verdicts. He investigated in Genesis 3. He investigates with Cain. God knows. But he asks Cain, where is your brother? And this gentleman is not just murderer, he is also an arrogant person. Also, God investigates the flood. And in chapter 6 of Genesis, you'll find his investigation. And then he produces his verdict. In Genesis 11:5, previously in 4, people said, well, the tower reaches the heavens. That was their perspective. But the omnipotent God, who can see everything, in verse 5, needed to come down in order to see the tower. That's how big and tall it was. But still, he investigated the situation. And then he produced a verdict. We may say that in Genesis 3, there are announcements of concepts that you can find later in the Bible. And those concepts are much more and in details developed later. Firstly, the idea of judgment. So God investigates, then he makes his judgment, his verdict. God's commandment precedes human accountability. God firstly reveals what is his will, then he holds humans accountable. There is a radical change in God-human relationship, and that goes until Revelation 21 and 20. There is a radical change in human-human relationship, and that goes until Revelation 21, 22. There is a radical change between the relationship between humans and animals and human and nature in general. That's why we are in a situation in which we are. Certain people, group of people, treated animals in different way, and probably we have a problem now. That's why we don't do handshakes anymore. Because there is a problem between humans and animals. That's only one aspect of the problem, of course. The radical change of human quality of life, laboring, whether in work or bearing children. Human disobedience leads to dying, to death. Let me be clear. Macula is introduced by church fathers, probably most of them St. Augustine, and he believed that every one of us was born with the guiltiness of Adam and Eve's sin. And that macula is actually a black spot in spiritual sense, and that's one of the reasons why little babies should be baptized. There is no macula. Adam and Eve were accountable for their sins. We are accountable for our situation. But because of Adam and Eve's sin, according to Paul, we die. God mitigates the consequences of human disobedience. So God always tries to find solution for humans, for their problem and the problem of sin. And that's probably what we call it the good news. probably the proto-evangelic statement of Genesis 3:15, where a human being will put his foot on the head of the serpent and the serpent will bite him back, is called proto-evangelion or first gospel because in a nutshell announces the future plan of the future solution of human sin. And also God as the creator, he has undisputable rights to impose limitations to human existence. We live in his universe. And he's got his principles and his rules. And we are called, if we would like to live proper life in this universe, we need to stick to these principles of life. Let me conclude. The structure of the plot and the characterization of the created beings, both humans and animals, point out to a radical change of the creational order. So this why I conclude that in Genesis 3 we can talk about fallen sin. God is characterized as someone who is ethically predictable. What does it mean? We can't predict God's actions in terms of details about the future. But we expect from God to behave in an ethically predictable way. So we know how God reacts on long terms to certain situations. We know that he's interested in us. We know that he takes initiative. We know that he's the icebreaker when we do sin, when we commit sin, and when we are hidden from him. He is the icebreaker. He is actively searching for us. We do not find Jesus, but Jesus finds us. God mitigates the circumstances. God tries to find solution to our problem. And he found it even before Genesis 3. But still, for these humans, that was not that well known in Genesis 3. But later in the Bible, that is described. And because God is ethically predictable, we can get into a quality relationship with him because we know what we can expect from him. That's how we build friendships. Friends are those human beings who we know how will behave in certain situations. They are ethically, morally predictable. That's why we can rely on them, because we know their character. We know their ethical system. We know how they will respond to certain situations. God is always inclined to mitigate even the most catastrophic situations. So that picture described especially by new atheists, we're taking texts here from there that portrays God as a character who is over eager to punish people now and here is not true. Because when you read the Bible from Genesis 1 until Revelation 21 and 22, God created a plan to bring humans from Genesis 3 situation into Genesis 1 and 2. So there is no dying in Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22. Everything in between, it's our situation, our reality. And it is not strange that Revelation 21 and 22, they have so many motifs that you can find in Genesis 1 and 2. Basically, Revelation 21 and 22 are new creation or renewed creation, new Garden of Eden. So this is just a start of journey for humans in Genesis 3, and we can say that we are in the middle of that journey. Eugene Peterson, the author of the translation of the Bible called The Message, once said that we are now in a situation far away from our good beginnings in Genesis 1 and 2. But at the same time, we are quite far away from the good ending of Revelation 21 and 22. However, I would add, God is very close to each of us. And don't miss that opportunity. Let us not miss that opportunity. And cling with Him. Stay with Him. Stick with Him. Listen to Him. Sometimes we don't understand Him. Very often. Sometimes we are confused by His behavior. But He proved Himself in the past. He proves on a daily basis to us. And on that basis, He will prove Himself for the future in the best possible way. Let us stay with Him. And on this journey, sometimes it's not easy to make the steps, but in His power, in His wisdom, with His support, we can arrive in the new Garden of Eden. Amen.